The sugarcane fields were vast, endless rows stretching toward the horizon, glistening beneath the merciless sun. To an outsider, they might have seemed beautiful, a vision of abundance, prosperity and order. But beauty in that place was a mask. Beneath the rhythm of the machetes, beneath the sweet scent of crushed cane, lay the quiet hum of suffering, the hidden foundation on which the plantation stood. Every stalk that rose tall in those fields had been watered not only with sweat, but with silence. And silence, in that world, was not peace. It was fear institutionalized. The enslaved people who worked there had long understood that silence was survival. The crack of the overseer's whip was not just punishment. It was a reminder that their voices did not belong to them. Day after day, they rose before dawn, their bodies weary, their spirits trained to obey. Yet even within that forced obedience, a subtle rebellion persisted. The refusal to let their humanity be erased. They sang softly, in rhythms that the masters could not decipher. They prayed in whispers that turned the air sacred again. They looked at one another, not as the world told them to, as property, but as kin. In those small acts, they kept alive the fire that oppression could not extinguish. The plantation owners believed they had mastered the art of control. They thought cruelty could build order, that punishment could instill loyalty, that fear could replace faith. But what they never understood was that control sustained by violence always breeds instability. You can cage a body, but not the soul that inhabits it. You can dictate labor, but not the dream of freedom that grows quietly in the dark. History, again and again, has shown that every system built on domination carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. The sugarcane fields were no exception. In that world, injustice had become normalized, almost invisible. It was stitched into the fabric of everyday life, in the way one person spoke to another, in the way power was distributed, in the way suffering was dismissed as necessary. The plantation was not just a place of work, it was a reflection of a moral disease, the kind that convinces the powerful that they are righteous simply because they hold authority. That, perhaps, is the most dangerous illusion humanity can entertain, to believe that power equals virtue. What made the setting of that story so haunting was precisely that contradiction, a world that saw itself as orderly, civilized, even godly, yet operated upon the complete dehumanization of others. The masters went to church, spoke of honor and morality, and still built their fortunes on human pain. That is the great hypocrisy of every oppressive system. It demands faith in public and denies justice in private. And the enslaved, living in the heart of that contradiction, carried the heavy truth the world refused to see. But even in that darkness, there were moments of light, fragile but real. A glance between workers that said, "We survive together." A song hummed at dusk that carried generations of strength. A prayer whispered not for deliverance but for endurance. Those small fragments of dignity, multiplied across years, became the spiritual rebellion that prepared the ground for something greater. Because history's most powerful transformations never begin with grand declarations, they begin with the quiet decision of individuals to remember their own worth. And so, the sugarcane fields, though drenched in suffering, also became the birthplace of resilience. The enslaved found ways to reclaim their humanity through the very acts meant to erase it. Each day they survived was an act of resistance. Each breath was defiance. Their endurance, though unseen, was more revolutionary than the violence of their oppressors. Because while cruelty can destroy, only courage can rebuild. If you look deeply, there is a kind of spiritual irony in it all. The masters believed themselves to be free, yet they were imprisoned by their greed and blindness. The enslaved, outwardly bound, carried a freedom that could not be bought or broken. The freedom of knowing that no whip can command the human spirit to stop yearning for justice. That is why history remembers not the names of those who owned the land, but the courage of those who endured it. This truth has echoed through centuries. Oppression always calls itself necessary. It always cloaks itself in reason, in religion, in order. But beneath every structure of oppression, there are people quietly refusing to believe the lie. And that refusal is the beginning of every liberation. The sugarcane fields, for all their cruelty, could not silence the rising awareness that the enslaved were not just laborers. They were human beings, carrying within them the same divine spark as those who claimed to own them. And that spark, once recognized, becomes unstoppable. It might take years, decades, even generations, but it always grows. That is the law of conscience, the law of history, the law of truth. Every system built on denial must one day face what it denied. And when that day comes, no amount of wealth or violence can protect those who refuse to see the humanity in others. So when we remember the sugarcane fields of that time, let us not see only the cruelty. Let us see the strength that bloomed in the midst of it. Let us see the unnamed men and women who carried entire worlds of hope inside them, while the world tried to erase them. Their silence was not emptiness, it was endurance. Their labor was not submission, it was testimony. And their story is not tragedy, it is triumph born in the most unlikely soil. Because history does not only live in the grand palaces of those who ruled, it breathes in the quiet places where people refuse to surrender their souls. And that is the truth the sugarcane fields still whisper today, that even in the darkest systems of control, the human spirit waits, not to be saved, but to rise. Nenti in every life where pain ceases to be merely something endured and begins to transform into something far greater. A catalyst, a fire, a voice. The enslaved woman at the heart of this story lived in a world where every breath was controlled, where her body was considered property, and where obedience was enforced not by reason, but by fear. Yet even within that suffocating system, there existed a space untouched, the private chamber of the human will. And it was there, within her, that something began to awaken. For years she had learned what silence demanded: to bow, to submit, to survive. Every day was a repetition of the same cycle: the sound of the overseer's commands, the crack of the whip, the endless hours in the fields. She had learned how to numb herself to the rhythm of cruelty. But the human soul, no matter how broken, remembers what it means to be free. Even when everything external is taken, the inner memory of dignity does not vanish. It lies dormant, waiting for a moment of reckoning. And that moment came. Her defiance did not begin as a scream. It began as a stillness, a decision, quiet but absolute, that she would no longer live as the world defined her. That is how true revolutions start, not in the noise of battle, but in the silence of resolve. Something within her shifted from endurance to resistance, from surviving to asserting the sacred truth of her own worth. That transformation, from fear to fire, is the most profound act of rebellion any human being can perform. To understand her awakening, we must look deeper than the historical record. It wasn't only a social rebellion, it was a spiritual one. She had lived her entire life under the illusion that others held dominion over her existence, that her fate was dictated by the cruelty of men and the machinery of a system designed to crush her spirit. But what she came to realize, slowly, painfully, was that no one could truly own her, not in the way they believed. They could command her labor, they could wound her body, but they could not possess her will. And once a person discovers that, they become dangerous to any system built on fear. It's a universal truth, extending beyond that single plantation, beyond that era of slavery. Every oppressive structure, whether political, social, or psychological, depends on convincing people that they are powerless. The moment that illusion breaks, the entire foundation begins to tremble. And that's what her defiance represented, a crack in the illusion. A moment where humanity rose from beneath centuries of cruelty and said, "No more." Her courage was not born of rage alone, it was born of remembrance. The memory of being human. The same breath that filled the lungs of her oppressors filled hers. The same sun that warmed their faces warmed hers. In that realization lay a quiet equality, something beyond words but more powerful than any law. It was as if the soul itself stood up inside her and refused to kneel again. Now, courage is often misunderstood. People imagine it as something loud and dramatic, but in truth, courage is clarity. It is the moment when confusion falls away and what must be done becomes undeniable. She did not act because she thought she would win. She acted because she could no longer accept a life without dignity. And that is what makes such acts holy, not their victory, but their necessity. When she stood her ground, she did so not only for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, shamed, or stripped of agency. Her defiance was a mirror, reflecting back to her oppressors the ugliness of their own system. In that moment, she reminded them, and perhaps the world, that even the most crushed spirit can rise again, and when it does, it exposes the weakness of the very structure that sought to destroy it. There is a psychological depth in this transformation that applies to all of us. Every human being faces systems of control, not always as visible as chains, but just as real. Fear, conformity, guilt, the weight of expectation, these are modern forms of bondage. And like her, each of us must decide whether we will remain bound by them or awaken to the truth that we are free to define ourselves. Her awakening was not just an act of physical defiance. It was the reclaiming of identity, the bold statement that her existence had meaning, not because others permitted it, but because she knew it within herself. That realization is the core of human freedom. You cannot wait for permission to become whole. You cannot wait for justice to be handed to you by the same hands that profit from injustice. Freedom begins the moment you decide to no longer participate in your own diminishment. That is what she discovered in those burning fields, that her life, her body, her soul, all belonged to something greater than the plantation, greater than fear, greater than death itself. And in that discovery, something sacred happened. The field, once a place of labor and pain, became a place of transformation. Her defiance turned the soil itself into witness. The wind that carried the overseer's shouts now carried her truth. The very landscape that had once confined her began to echo her spirit. And though history may never record her name, that moment became eternal, because every act of moral courage ripples through time. The powerful want to believe that their dominance is permanent. They build systems, write laws, and construct myths to sustain their authority. But what they cannot control is the quiet awakening of the human soul. Once a single person decides to stand in truth, the illusion of superiority begins to crumble. That's what happened that day. A single act of awareness, a single heartbeat of courage, and an empire of fear began to tremble. Her defiance was not an ending. It was a beginning. It was the moment the enslaved became sovereign over her own spirit. And through that sovereignty, she gave the world a lesson that still burns true, that dignity is not given, it is claimed. And that is the essence of her transformation, the moment when fear turned into fire, and one woman's silent awakening became the light that history could never extinguish. There is a certain moment in history, and in the human soul, when pain no longer submits to silence, when the cry that was once buried beneath fear begins to rise, not just as sound, but as purpose. That moment came for her not in grand revolt, not in a scene of victory, but in a quiet breaking point when she realized that justice was not going to come from anyone's mercy. It had to come from her own hands. Imagine what it means to live in a world where every rule tells you that you are nothing, where even your suffering is denied meaning, where every voice that tries to speak truth is punished into silence. For her, justice was not a word written in law or spoken from a pulpit. It was something that pulsed within her veins. It was the last piece of herself that she refused to surrender. And when that final boundary of her dignity was violated, something sacred ignited within her, the understanding that sometimes, to remain human, one must act in defiance of inhumanity. This was not a decision made in fury alone. It was born of long nights under a sky that seemed to look away, born of the humiliation she endured, the betrayal of her body, and the theft of her peace. She did not lash out because she was wild. She acted because she remembered what justice was meant to be. When those 3 overseers committed their cruelty, they believed they had erased her humanity entirely. They believed that her silence would remain eternal, that the system that empowered them would shield them from consequence. But they forgot that the human spirit, when pressed beyond endurance, ceases to fear. And in that space beyond fear, she found her strength. What makes her act so powerful is not simply what she did, but what it meant. It was not vengeance for its own sake. It was restoration. In striking back, she reclaimed ownership over her own existence. Her body, once treated as a tool of others' power, became an instrument of truth. She did not ask for permission to defend her dignity. She embodied it. And that is where the deepest truth lies, that justice, when born from the soul, is not about revenge but about balance. It is the soul's demand that wrongs be answered with courage, that the world be reminded of the line between humanity and brutality. There's a philosophical weight to her defiance. In moral terms, it forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality, that when systems of justice fail, when institutions side with oppression, the act of reclaiming one's dignity often appears as rebellion. Yet rebellion in such a world is not sin, it is sacred duty. She understood that her silence would perpetuate the lie that enslaved people had no power, no will, no right to resist. But her action shattered that illusion. In one act, she exposed the moral bankruptcy of her oppressors. She showed that even in the darkest conditions, a spark of divine justice still lived within the human heart. Psychologically, her act was a declaration of wholeness. Trauma often divides a person, body from spirit, action from will. But in choosing to act, she stitched herself back together. The part of her that had been silenced rejoined the part that still believed in freedom. That moment of decision was her resurrection, not in body, but in spirit. She became whole again, not because the world changed, but because she refused to let the world define her anymore. And if we look beyond the historical setting, her courage speaks directly to our own era. We live in a time when many feel voiceless, crushed not by chains, but by fear, apathy, or injustice of another kind. The lesson her life offers is timeless: that silence, even when it seems safe, slowly destroys the soul. There comes a point when to remain silent is to become complicit in your own erasure. Justice, whether personal or collective, demands a voice, a stand. It demands that we refuse to be comfortable with the suffering of the innocent, that we reject systems that profit from silence. She was not educated in philosophy, yet she understood what philosophers spend lifetimes trying to define. That moral power comes not from position or privilege, but from conviction. She embodied what it means to be human in its purest form, the willingness to confront evil, even when every external force insists that you have no right to. Her act was not sanctioned by law, but it was justified by truth. It was the universe correcting itself through the courage of one woman who had been told she was nothing, and chose to prove she was everything. Her justice was not the kind written into records or debated in courts. It was the justice of the soul, immediate, undeniable, absolute. The kind that doesn't wait for approval. The kind that makes history pause and re-evaluate what it means to be righteous. In the field where she stood, she was no longer a slave. She was the embodiment of divine balance, a force that reminded the world that every cruelty has a limit, that every oppressor meets the boundary of human will, and that is where the philosophical beauty of her story lies. Justice, in its truest form, does not belong to the powerful, it belongs to the awakened. When a person's conscience aligns with truth, they become ungovernable. Her oppressors could not comprehend that kind of power, because they had spent their lives confusing dominance with strength. But she showed that real strength is moral clarity, the refusal to surrender one's humanity, even after it has been assaulted and stripped bare. As we reflect on her story, we must ask ourselves, how often do we tolerate injustice because it is safer than confrontation? How often do we let wrongs persist because we tell ourselves it's not our battle to fight? Her courage exposes that illusion. It tells us that justice is not an abstract ideal. It is a living demand that begins with each individual's decision to act in truth. In her defiance, she became more than a figure of tragedy. She became a teacher. Through her pain, she showed us that justice begins where fear ends, and that dignity, once reclaimed, can light the path for generations to come. And perhaps that is the message she leaves behind for us all, that even in a world built on cruelty, the heart that dares to seek justice becomes unbreakable. And when one soul stands in truth, it is enough to remind the whole world that power built on fear can never silence the fire of freedom. When a single act of courage enters the world, it does not remain confined to the person who performs it. It moves, quietly at first, through hearts, through whispers, through the small and hidden places where people still carry fear, and soon that courage becomes contagious. That is what happened on that plantation in Brazil. One woman's defiance, one moment of justice reclaimed, broke through generations of silence. It was as if her act tore a hole in the veil that had covered truth for too long. And through that tear, light began to spill into the darkness. At first there was shock. Even those who had lived closest to her could hardly believe what had happened. The other enslaved men and women, used to surviving in a world of cruelty, had learned to bow their heads and swallow injustice because rebellion meant death. But when they saw what she had done, not in hatred, but in fierce conviction, they felt something awaken inside them. It wasn't just admiration, it was recognition. For the first time they saw proof that fear could be conquered, that even within the walls of captivity, freedom could begin in the heart. You see, there's a mysterious law in human nature. When one person finds the courage to act against injustice, others begin to see what is possible. Her act rippled through the fields like wind through cane. People began to look differently at their oppressors, not as untouchable gods of power, but as fragile men clinging to authority built on lies. And that shift, that inner change, is where revolutions truly begin. Not in armies or declarations, but in the quiet conviction that the world as it is cannot remain the same. The overseers who survived the masters who ruled, they felt it too. They could not name it, but they sensed it. The trembling of an old order beginning to weaken. They tried to erase her story, to bury it under threats, to forbid her name from being spoken. But they were too late. What had been done could not be undone. Her act had revealed something that could not be hidden again. The truth that moral power belongs to the oppressed the moment they stop believing the oppressor's illusion. Even among the enslaved, there was debate. Some said she had gone too far, that such defiance would only bring more suffering. Others whispered that she had done what all of them wished they could. But whatever their words, no one could deny the shift in the air. The plantation was no longer the same. The master's house seemed less grand, the chains less absolute. Her defiance had cracked the very psychology that slavery depended on, the belief that those who suffer must remain silent. And this is where her story transcends time and geography. Because every age has its plantations, systems built on control, on fear, on the silencing of truth. They may not use chains anymore, but they still rely on the same illusion, that ordinary people are powerless, that justice belongs only to those who sit on thrones or behind desks of influence. But the enslaved woman's defiance proves otherwise. Real justice is not maintained by authority, it's awakened by conscience. When her story began to circulate beyond the plantation, through whispers, songs, fragments of memory, it became something larger than her. It became a symbol of the human spirit's refusal to die. The people who heard it, even decades later, may not have known her name, but they felt her presence. Her courage became part of their own. And that is the secret of moral revolutions. One act of truth, telling, can outlive empires. From a philosophical view, her courage embodies what thinkers like Kierkegaard and Camus later tried to describe. The moment when an individual, facing an absurd and unjust world, asserts meaning by their own will. She didn't wait for justice to descend from heaven or for rulers to recognize her humanity. She created meaning through action. In that instant, she transcended her circumstance and entered the realm of the eternal, the space where human conscience speaks louder than fear. It's easy, centuries later, to underestimate the magnitude of what she did. But imagine it, one woman, stripped of power, standing alone against a system that believed itself immortal. She didn't have wealth, or weapons, or protection. Yet, she changed the moral atmosphere of her world simply by refusing to accept her condition as fate. That kind of power doesn't fade with time. It doesn't die with her body. It continues to echo through every act of resistance that came after, in every fight for justice, every voice that says, enough. And perhaps that is why those who ruled feared her so deeply. Not because she had broken their laws, but because she had revealed that their laws were already broken. Her defiance made them confront what they had long denied, that their authority was not rooted in truth, but in violence and lies. Her courage stripped them bare, exposing the weakness of men who confuse control with righteousness. There's something profoundly spiritual about that kind of revelation, because true justice, in its essence, doesn't need to shout or conquer. It simply exists, as a mirror held up to the face of evil, reflecting back the truth that it cannot endure forever. Her life became that mirror, and those who looked into it, whether enslaved or free, were changed. Some turned away, afraid of what they saw. Others, the brave ones, looked deeper and began to live differently. So when we speak of the echo of justice, it isn't just metaphor, it's reality. Her courage traveled through generations, quietly shaping the moral memory of a people. Her defiance gave strength to those who would later fight for abolition, for equality, for dignity. Even now, long after her name has been forgotten by the pages of official history, her spirit continues to remind us that no injustice lasts forever, not when the human soul refuses to accept it. And that's the heart of it, isn't it? History remembers kings, conquerors, and generals. But it's often the nameless ones, the women and men who act from conscience when no one is watching, who truly change the course of humanity. She didn't seek glory, she sought truth, and that made her more powerful than every master who ever tried to own her. So, if her story tells us anything, it is this: courage multiplies. Justice, once awakened, spreads like fire through dry grass. One act of moral clarity can shake a world built on lies. And when one soul dares to stand in truth, that truth does not end with them, it begins. You said expand key point 5 into a 800-word segment that flows naturally within the overall speech, aligning seamlessly with the other key points. The tone should be intellectual and authoritative, yet accessible, mirroring Barley Graham approach. The language should be clear and direct, with a focus on psychological and philosophical depth. Avoid any formal headings, keeping the delivery conversational, as if speaking to an audience in a lecture or interview format. Conclude with a powerful, concise closing statement that leaves the audience with something to reflect on, motivating them to act on the insights. Share. ChatGPT said, "History has a strange habit of remembering the wrong people. It carves the names of conquerors into stone, celebrates the masters of power, and forgets the nameless hands that built the world they ruled. The woman whose courage we speak of did not leave behind a title, a lineage, or even a grave marked with her name. Yet, her legacy is more enduring than that of the men who claimed to own her. She belongs to that vast, invisible army of souls whose courage became the moral foundation upon which future generations would stand." Her story, like so many others, was almost erased. Plantation owners feared such tales because they were contagious. They inspired questions that threatened the system's very survival. So they tried to bury her memory under silence. Her name was removed from records, her defiance labeled madness or sin. The few who remembered whispered her story in secret, passing it down through fragments. A song hummed in the fields, a prayer murmured at night, a child's question answered with a story too dangerous to tell aloud. That is how she survived, not in ink but in spirit. This is the quiet paradox of history, that truth does not depend on recognition to exist. It lives wherever conscience refuses to forget. Her story became a pulse beneath the skin of her people's memory, a reminder that even when the world refuses to record justice, it cannot erase it. The power of her life was not in how long she lived, but in what she awakened in others. She became, in a sense, eternal, not by the written word, but by the transmission of courage itself. There's something profoundly philosophical in this, the idea that legacy is not measured in fame, but in transformation. Her defiance did not make her a hero in her lifetime, it made her a danger. But time has a way of purifying what fear once distorted. As the years passed, and slavery's chains began to rust, her story reemerged not as scandal, but as symbol. To those who suffered, she became proof that resistance was possible. To those who oppressed, she became a warning that no empire stands forever. And so her legacy began to travel, through generations of workers, abolitionists, mothers, and preachers who invoked her spirit without even knowing her name. She became the faceless archetype of courage, the one who stood when standing meant death. Every revolution, every demand for human dignity that followed, carried within it something of her fire, because that's how moral energy works. Once released into the world, it cannot be recalled. It may go unseen, but it continues to move through time, reshaping hearts and awakening justice where none seemed possible. In this way, her anonymity became her strength. Had her name been known, she might have been confined to a single story, a single place. But because she was unnamed, She became everyone, a mirror in which any oppressed soul could see themselves. She transcended history and entered mythology, not in fantasy, but in truth. The kind of truth that defines humanity's deepest struggle, the fight to be recognized as fully human in a world that tries to deny it. You see, the forgotten of history are not truly lost. They are simply waiting to be remembered by those with eyes to see and hearts to understand. Her story speaks to the moral duty of remembrance, not as sentiment, but as justice. To remember her is to restore balance to the narrative of humanity. It's to declare that power does not have the final word. Conscience does. And when we choose to remember those whom history erased, we participate in their resurrection. There's also a psychological truth here. When people are denied acknowledgement, their humanity becomes a kind of ghost, haunting the collective conscience until it is recognized. The enslaved woman's courage became such a ghost. It lingered in Brazil's sugarcane fields, in the moral discomfort of those who profited from slavery, and later, in the conscience of a nation struggling to define freedom. Her story became the voice that refused to die, the question that would not go away. What kind of world allows such things to happen? And that question is the beginning of change. Because that's what legacy really is. Not the comfort of being remembered, but the power to awaken the living. Her life, her defiance, her unrecorded sacrifice. They became a moral inheritance for all who came after. Each time someone stands against injustice, even in a different form, her spirit is there. Each time a person refuses silence, she lives again. And that's the beauty of truth. It doesn't need permission to survive. It only needs one soul brave enough to carry it forward. So when we look back on her story, we aren't simply studying history, we are confronting ourselves. We are being asked whether we, too, will allow our world to erase the inconvenient truths that challenge comfort and power. Because if silence can bury the courageous, it can also bury justice. Remembering her is more than an act of respect. It's an act of resistance against forgetfulness. It's how we ensure that the same cruelty never finds fertile ground again. We live in a time when people chase recognition, where legacy is measured by visibility. But her story reminds us that the greatest legacies are often invisible. They live not in monuments, but in the moral fiber of those who refuse to bow to wrong. Her name may be lost, but her spirit has traveled farther than any monument ever could. She became the proof that even the smallest act of courage can outlast centuries of power. And so, the forgotten enslaved woman of 1846, the one who stood alone and faced the impossible, still speaks, not with words but with example. She teaches us that real justice begins when ordinary people, stripped of everything, still choose to act with extraordinary conviction. That even when history tries to forget you, truth remembers. And perhaps that is her ultimate victory, that though the world erased her name, it could not erase her light. She became the echo of every conscience that dares to say no to injustice. And as long as her story is told, even in whispers, she is still winning